Hey friends, Matt aka Martin here, and in this video I want to take a dive in and explore what sidechaining actually is, some of its uses beyond just typical sidechain compression, and if you stick around until the end of the video, I'll show you a cool way that you can use sidechaining concepts and apply them to literally any single parameter inside of Ableton Live. Let's get started. So first up, what is sidechaining? Well, sidechaining is basically in effect the triggering of an effect on one sound with the level or amplitude input of another sound or an external source. Probably the most common usage of sidechain is to trigger the gain reduction of a compressor using an external sound source, such as reducing the level of a bass sound when the kick drum plays a note. So to demonstrate this here, I've got this 4-bar little trance loop, and there's no sidechain compression or sidechain anything going on in here, but let's take a listen to this and see how we can apply sidechaining in different ways. So first up, let's demonstrate sidechain compression between the kick drum and that main bass sound. So in order to apply sidechain compression, first off, we need to find the sound that we want to duck out of the way of another sound. In this case, I'm going to go to this acid line here. We'll close up this delay return rack, and I'm going to insert a compressor at the end of this signal chain. Now in Ableton Live, there are a few different effects that can take a sidechain input, the compressor being one of them. And if an effect can take a sidechain input, you'll see this little arrow in the top left corner of the device next to the device activator button. So in the case of the compressor, I'm going to click on this arrow and this will open up our sidechain input section. So here is what our bass line sounds like. And what I want to do is have this duck out of the way every time the kick drum plays a note. Now, a compressor is a device that reacts to the incoming signal and then turns down the signal when it gets too loud. And in the case of what we're going to do here is we're going to get the compressor to turn down the bass sound when the kick drum reaches a certain level. To do this, I'm going to engage the side chain of the compressor, select the audio from input from the sound that I'm wanting to trigger the gain reduction of the compressor, in this case, the kick, and then I'm going to set where in the signal chain that I want this compressor to receive the audio from. It doesn't really matter in the case of this, and you can go either pre-effects or post-effects, just don't go post-mixer. I'm going to leave it set to post-effects here. And now you'll see that the input meter on the compressor is actually reading the input from the kick drum whilst it's passing through the audio of the bass. And as I reduce the threshold on this compressor, we're going to be triggering the gain reduction circuit of the compressor on this bass every time the kick drum plays a note. And you can hear now that our bass is ducking out of the way of the kick drum every single time the kick drum plays a note. With the compressor off, and with it back on. So from here, we can adjust parameters of the compressor, like the ratio, turning it up all the way to infinity to 1. And then we can adjust the envelope of the compressor, so how this gain reduction is going to react by adjusting things like the attack time, making it quite fast, and the release time to change how long it takes for this bass sound to get back to full volume after the kick drum has played a sound. Now this is great, except for the fact that our kick drum is actually quite a large and long sound. And you'll hear there that even with a very short release and short attack, our bass is still being ducked out of the way quite a lot. And if I want this to be a little bit quicker, there's not a huge amount I can do just using this ratio, attack, release, and threshold control in order to make this gain reduction a little bit snappier. And in fact, this is much easier to see in the activity view of the compressor. Here we can see that gray shape is the input level of the kick drum, and that yellow line is the amount of gain reduction being applied to the bass sound. And here what we can see is that our kick drum is actually quite a long sound. So in order to get a little bit more control over the amount of sidechain compression being applied to our bass, I can actually engage the Sidechain Input filter, or the Sidechain Input EQ, by clicking on this button right here. And what this allows me to do is apply an EQ, either a filter or some kind of EQ boost or cut or something like that, to our input signal, which in the case of this compressor is our kick drum. Now, in the case of this kick drum, there's a lot of that main energy of the kick drum in the low frequency of the signal, which I want to actually remove in order to trigger this compressor with just that kind of initial click of the kick drum. To do this, I'm going to set our EQ to a high pass filter, and then I can increase the cutoff frequency so that we just kind of get the click of this kick drum to trigger the gain reduction of the compressor. And as I do this, you'll see that our gain reduction here is showing a much snappier amount of compression. And now what I can do is reduce the threshold a little bit further, and now our attack and release controls are giving us a lot more control over the envelope of the gain reduction applied to this bass sound. So I can give a bit more of a pumping sound by increasing the release slightly. And this results in a much cleaner sidechain compression. It's also possible to apply sidechain compression to what we'd call a ghost sidechain input. And this is a sound that we're not necessarily hearing in the final mix, but is being used to trigger the sidechain capabilities of a device, such as in this case, a compressor. So say for instance that I couldn't actually get the kick drum sound to trigger the compressor the way that I wanted, regardless of how I EQ'd it. What I would do in this case is create a ghost trigger sound to trigger this compressor that's mimicking the rhythmic pattern of the kick drum. So here in this session, I have this operator track up the top, which is simply just a white noise click sound. What I'm going to do is copy over the MIDI from this kick drum onto this operator track. So now we have a consistent 4 to the floor click sound playing in this white noise click that is mimicking the pattern in the kick drum. You can make this kind of click sound yourself, or you could use some kind of a sample like a hi-hat and just make it really, really, really short. And then again, you could apply some filtering and stuff like that if you wanted to. But what we want here is just this really short, snappy, clicky sound. Now I can go back to that bass line, and instead of having the sidechain input received from the kick drum, I can receive it from that operator. And now our compressor is being triggered by that white noise click rather than by our kick drum. I can turn off the EQ on the input and now have a listen to the amount of control we get over the amount of compression applied. If I play this in context with the kick, the shakers, and the open hi-hat, let's take a listen. Without the compressor, and with. So using an external input to trigger the gain reduction circuit of a compressor in this way is known as sidechain compression, regardless of whether we're doing it with an existing sound in the mix or some kind of ghost sidechain trigger. Because this is such a common technique, the use of sidechain compression or kind of volume ducking has colloquially become known as just sidechaining. However, the technique of sidechaining extends beyond just simply using it in this particular way. So now I want to show you a few other ways that you can use sidechaining concepts on other effects inside of Ableton Live and potentially in your own DAW as well if you use a different digital audio workstation. The first thing I want to show here is the use of sidechain gating. Now, for those of you who don't know, a gate is basically the opposite of a compressor, turning down a signal whenever it falls below a certain level instead of turning down a signal whenever it goes above a certain level. So here I have this kind of vocal-esque pad, which sounds like this. And in the context of the mix, this gets a little bit too overwhelming. And what I want to do is add some kind of rhythmic interest to this sound. Now, there are a couple of ways that I can do this, but in this example, I want to use the technique of sidechain gating. So I'm going to load up the gate effect, and I'm going to put it before the delay and reverb here. And as we see with the gate, we get this little triangle up the top left, which means I can open up this gate and we get a sidechain input trigger. Now, there are a few different things that I could sidechain gate this particular element to. First off, let's try sidechain gating it to the bass sound. So let's engage the sidechain input, select the audio from the acid line, and now whenever the acid line reaches a certain level, it's going to allow the vocal synth to pass through the gate. In order to hear this effect, I'm going to turn off the delay and reverb here on this vocal pad, and now I'm going to turn on the acid line, and if I play this sound, take a listen to what happens to this vocal pad. You'll hear it basically play the same rhythm as this bass sound. We can adjust parameters such as the return here, the release and hold amounts, and we can also apply a Sidechain Input EQ to the input of the acid line, much like we did with the kick drum, to adjust how this gate responds to the incoming signal. If I engage the delay and the reverb, now we can kind of spread this out in the space a little bit. And if I now turn on the drums as well, take a listen to what this sounds like. Without the gate, and with the gate. We could also take the input for our gate from any of the other tracks in our session, or even a ghost sidechain trigger like we did before, to create our own kind of rhythmic patterns for our synth. And this is actually really a common technique and a really cool one to be able to add extra rhythmic interest to your sounds. Another effect that we can apply sidechaining to inside of Ableton Live is actually the auto filter device. So here I have this kind of sigh thing sound, which on its own sounds like this. And what I want to do is add some interesting filter movement to this sound. So I'm going to insert an auto filter device after the delay here, and I'm going to set this auto filter to bandpass mode. We're going to reduce the filter frequency, increase the resonance, and maybe set it to a 12 dB per octave slope. Now this is what we have. And you'll see here on this auto filter device that we also have this triangle in the top left corner. If I unfold this, scroll over, we'll see we have a sidechain input. Now on this sidechain input, I'm actually going to sidechain it from an external ghost trigger, which I have already set up in this track 8 operator right here. And this is the same clicky white noise sound that I had in the initial ghost sidechain trigger, except this time I have some variation in the level of this particular sound using the velocity in the MIDI clip in this track. This is what it sounds like. And what this is going to allow me to do is adjust the position on the filter on that sigh thing track based on the level of this clicky sidechain ghost trigger. If I go back to the sigh thing track, I'm going to turn on the sidechain input, select the audio from input number 8. And then in order for the sidechain to actually trigger the movement of the filter here, I need to either increase or decrease the envelope on the depth of this filter. So the auto filter can have this envelope trigger, which basically moves the filter cutoff frequency based on the input level. And in this case, we're moving it based on the input of a sidechain trigger. So if I solo this sigh thing track, as I adjust this envelope parameter, take a listen to what happens to the movement of this filter. We can adjust the envelope or the slope of this movement based on the attack and release controls. I can have it start at a different filter position. And a cool thing about the auto filter is that I can actually also quantize the movement of this auto filter to beat divisions such as 16th notes or 8th notes by engaging this little quantize right here. And I can have this move every 16th note and stay at the position that it moves to at that 16th note rather than moving up and down in a smooth motion. So let's turn this on to number 1 right here, which is 16th notes. Now take a listen to this filter. And so you'll hear there that the filter is moving based on the input of that white noise trigger. If I turn off the filter, this was our original sound. and turning it back on, we get this filter movement based on the input level of that white noise. Now, in context with the other things that we've added so far, so with the vocal sound, the acid line, and the rest of our drums, take a listen to what we have. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to leave a like down below, subscribe if you're new, and if you're really enjoying my content, make sure to head on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you can support me by buying me a coffee, getting some things from my shop such as free downloads or paid racks, or becoming a member to support me on a regular basis. I'm going to put up this project on my Buy Me a Coffee for all active members, so if you'd like to get your hands on this project to dive in and see how I've created some of the sounds and stuff like that, make sure to become a member and then you'll be able to grab this project file. There'll be a link down in the description. Now, there are also other devices that can take a sidechain input, such as the multiband dynamics device and the glue compressor device. And there are also some devices that can take MIDI sidechain inputs, such as Corpus, Shifter, and Spectral Resonator. Many third-party plugins also have the ability to take sidechain inputs depending on what the plugin does. And if it does have the capability to take a sidechain input, just look for that little arrow in the top left of the device in the device view. Now, in terms of sidechaining with audio, there's also a way that you can effectively apply sidechaining concepts to pretty much any parameter inside of Ableton Live, whether that's on an effect or on a synth or even on mixer tracks using the envelope follower Max for Live device. So here inside this project, I have this stabs sound, which sounds like this. And what I want to do is actually apply some kind of interesting movement to an effect on this sound, say a phaser or a flanger. So let's add a phaser flanger to here. I'm going to turn down the amount on here. And what I actually want to do is have this dry wet control here move up and down just rhythmically based on some kind of other interesting sound. So what I have here is this loop, which sounds like this. Which I've added a gate to just to remove some of those lower level parts of the loop. And what I'm going to do is now add an envelope follower, which is effectively a device that looks at the input level of the signal and then allows you to map that identified level to the parameter of basically any effect or device inside of Ableton Live. All I need to do is click on this map button, and then I'll go to the stabs track, click on this dry wet control, and now the level of this dry wet is controlled by the level of this envelope follower identifying the loop. So if I go back to the stabs track, take a look at the movement of this dry wet signal. You'll see that it's moving up and down in time with the loop track. So in order to get this to move a little bit more, I'm just going to increase the gain of this envelope follower. Now let's engage this stabs and take a listen to what it sounds like with the movement of this phaser. I'll increase the feedback a little bit so we can hear the movement of this a little bit more. Let's maybe invert the polarity, go back to the loop, and we can adjust the rise and fall time so that we get a little bit of a smoother movement. And again, that loop that's being used to trigger that phaser flanger device is not actually audible in the final track. So now with all of those sidechain devices that we've used here, the sidechain compression on the acid line, the sidechain gate on the vocal track, the sidechain auto filter on the side thing, and the kind of sidechain phaser on the stabs line, here is what we now have. So get creative with your sidechaining and see what you can do with sidechaining beyond just the typical sidechain compression. Don't forget that if you want to download this project, I'll make it available for all members over on my Buy Me a Coffee page. Check out this video right here if you want to deep dive into Ableton Live's reverb audio effect. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.